Thank you for the invitation. I'm excited to be here, and I was able to hear Lieutenant Governor Barnes' presentation earlier, so I appreciated the opening. I'll just mention a little bit about Wisconsin's Green Fire. Some of you are familiar with us, but we're now a 3-year-old organization dedicated to advancing science and professionalism in conservation and natural resource management. And Green Fire is organized primarily as a membership organization. About roughly half of our 500 members are conservation professionals of some stripe with a very wide range of backgrounds, including wildlife management, fisheries management, water quality, water regulation, and including agricultural conservation programs, air quality, and climate change, and the list goes on. But as a result, most of our work and most of our effort is really built around the efforts of our professional members who have a really wide range of backgrounds and give us the ability to tackle a lot of different issues. So what I'd like to talk with you all about today is the role of natural and working lands and what's often called climate mitigation. And essentially, I know you all talk a lot about adaptation to climate change, about the impact of floods and droughts and the other weather extremes that are creating stresses and impacting our farmlands, our forest lands, and our conservation lands in Wisconsin. We'll touch on that a little bit today, but we're going to turn the lens to one of the other sides of the issue, and that's the potential for all of our working lands to basically absorb greenhouse gas emissions, which is something that they do naturally. I want to stress here that I'll be talking about agriculture a little bit, and although I own some farmland, I am not a farmer and not an agronomist. And at some point, I may be following up with some of you as we continue to advance both ideas and policy proposals around these issues. So if we can go to the next slide. This is kind of a big picture global view of carbon fluxes in the atmosphere developed by the EPA. That I find a helpful way to kick off a talk like this. And basically this little schematic is mapping the fluxes of greenhouse gases both into and from the atmosphere. Just a couple of things I want to call your attention to. If you look over on the far right red arrow that's going up, that's fossil fuels and cement. Those are estimated by our EPA to contribute about 6 gigatons a year of net greenhouse gas emissions or CO2 equivalent emissions into the atmosphere. And most people don't deal in gigatons, but that's essentially 6 billion tons a year. If you look at the arrow just to the left of that, that's diagonally headed up to the northwest, changing land use, you'll note there that that's estimated to be 1.4 gigatons a year. And that you can think of basically conversion of lands, such as forest or conservation lands or farmlands that might be changed to other uses. And we know that as a result of development or land conversion, that's one of our biggest sources of greenhouse gas emissions. So that's 1.4 billion gigatons a year. If you look over to the far left of that chart, the two offsetting green arrows around respiration and photosynthesis. The good news of that cycle for us is that on net, those two activities are sequestering about 1.3 gigatons of CO2 per year. That's essentially the fluxes of respiration as plants emit CO2 as they break down or as they die. That's upgoing, and then the return is the photosynthetic activity that actually stores carbon by pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere. And so if you look at those numbers, you realize that by this estimation, we're offsetting almost 25% of our fossil fuel and cement emissions just through the activities of plants, trees, crops, and other terrestrial photosynthetic activity. So that's the process that we really want to focus on, and the process that gives us an opportunity to help tackle the climate change issue through optimizing the role of working lands and conservation lands. If you go to the next slide, please. So I want to flag one organization that is really focused on this effort, and that's an organization called the United States Climate Alliance. So if you remember back in 2016 and before 2016, the Paris Climate Accord resulted in really meaningful and encouraging global consensus and commitment to meeting greenhouse gas reduction goals. The United States was a signatory to the Paris Climate Accord. Since 2016 and with the new administration, as you know, the United States has withdrawn from the Paris Climate Accord and is no longer bound by those commitments. The U.S. Climate Alliance is an organization that is basically arisen to support states that individually want to make a commitment to meet the Paris Climate Accord goals for greenhouse gas reductions. And currently there are, I believe, 26 US states that are members of the United States Climate Alliance. The Climate Alliance provides a variety of support to those states around several different initiatives, and one of them is the Natural and Working Lands Initiative. So US Climate Alliance with support from groups like the American Farmland Trust, the Trust for Public Lands, the Nature Conservancy, the American Forests organization, and others support member states through helping them develop initiatives to basically increase the carbon and climate offset potential of natural and working lands, our farms and our forests. So that group is working with the administration in Wisconsin, including Lieutenant Governor Barnes and his staff, as well as staff in DADCAP and DNR. So really helping provide the support and the information to move the ball. Next slide, please. So I'm going to point to, over the next few minutes, some modeling research that's been done over the last 3 years or so that's really tried to estimate what is both the current and the potential for what we're calling collectively natural and working lands to offset CO2 emissions. And I'm going to point to work that's been sponsored by the Nature Conservancy as well as other partners that has really tried to develop models for estimating what changes would occur in our carbon budgets as a result of farm, forest, and conservation activities. Collectively, if you look at unpublished work that's been done by some of these groups for Wisconsin, you can estimate that we could offset somewhere in the order of 16 million tons of CO2 per year, or as much as 20% of our annual net greenhouse gas emissions. That's consistent with estimates that TNC and other groups have made to suggest that nationally, we could be meeting as much as a third of the goals for greenhouse gas reduction that need to occur to meet the Paris Climate Accord goals. As much as a third of those goals could be achieved through better management of farms, forests, and conservation lands. So that's really the focus of this entire strategy. We'll go to the next slide, please. So you all are well familiar with our land base in Wisconsin. Based on the estimations from the DNR's collaboration with the UW and others, the WisClan 2.0, we estimate that we have about 25% of our land base in agriculture, with another 12% or so estimated to be in grassland, much of which would be pasture or other perennial cover, but collectively would be part of agriculture. And that, I think, comes fairly close to estimates that DATCAP and other groups would make for our statewide farm base. About 40% of our land and forest cover in the state, about 16% in wetlands, and about 4.5% in urban lands. And then there's a few outlier categories that are much smaller amounts. But really, these are all places where we have the opportunity to mitigate climate change and increase our sequestration of carbon, our reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. The next slide, please. So I'm showing here a shot of, this is unpublished work that the U.S. Climate Alliance has sponsored from Nature Conservancy scientists and other researchers to try to model what would happen in Wisconsin if we pulled all the levers to try to maximize our carbon potential on natural and working lands. The bars on the right, the numbers there may be fairly faint, but the size of those bars is telling you their estimation of the potential impact from that particular strategy. On the uppermost bar, you'll see that avoided grassland conversion is their #1 strategy using their estimates and their assumptions. And if that was, if that lever was pulled to its maximum, we would sequester about 4 million pounds of additional CO2 per year. 4 million tons. And an easy way to think about this is that by the estimates I'm aware of, Wisconsin's net fossil fuel greenhouse gas emissions annually are about 98 million tons a year currently. So very roughly, 1 million tons of reduction is about a 1% reduction. So if you want to spitball this, which is appropriate given how many assumptions are built into these numbers, you can see that they're estimating about 4% of our, avoiding grassland conversion would offset about 4% of our current emissions. Likewise, their estimate is that about 3.5 million tons of CO2 could be offset or sequestered by an enhanced effort at forest restocking, meaning getting additional trees planted to bring forest cover up to full stocking, and kind of optimizing the carbon storage in existing forests. With reforestation, they're estimating about 2.5 million tons through. Everything okay technically? Yeah. Okay. 2.5 million tons through tree planting efforts. However, farm agricultural practices, including conversion to pasture or silvopasture or cover crops or nutrient management, all have significant potential inputs. If you dive in and look at the assumptions behind these estimates, I think there will always be cases where you can question whether those were the right assumptions. For example, with avoided grassland conversion, they're estimated 4 million tons plus. That was based on the extent of conversion, I think, out of CRP predominantly that occurred over the last decade back into annual crops. Whether or not that trend would continue without additional action today, I think is an open question. But this gives you a flavor, at least, of where the folks working on this believe that some of the biggest opportunities are. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned before, I'm not an agronomist, and I'm not an expert in this area. Based on the people that I've listened to, and I think agronomists who have worked on this issue, some of the estimates, the most reliable estimates I'm aware of, are that overall agriculture in our current model in Wisconsin, primarily annual agriculture, is a net carbon source. And I think that is based on the understanding that in addition to soil carbon losses that come from annual tillage, we're also contributing greenhouse gases to the atmosphere in the form of nitrous oxide that's coming from synthetic fertilizer predominantly, methane that's coming obviously from ruminants, as well as energy usage that occurs in farm operations. And as I'm sure you know, nitrous oxide and methane are much more powerful greenhouse gases than CO2, so they have per unit of volume, a unit of mass, they have a significantly higher greenhouse forcing ability, and so they're weighted at a significantly higher level per ton. And when you see CO2 equivalents, that's what that number is really trying to balance, those different greenhouse gases. Opportunities to reduce the extent to which farmland is a greenhouse gas source is still a very important strategy to consider, and I think Wisconsin as a state would want to consider. Next slide, please. So according to the estimates, if you roll together the different agricultural practices that have been done in these various assessments, we could offset as much as 6 million tons of CO2 per year. Whether those numbers are accurate or to what degree, I don't personally spend too much time sweating bullets over, again, because the assumptions are quite subjective in some cases. But we do know, I think with a great deal of certainty, that almost all of the practices that would bring greenhouse gas benefits, such as cover crops, such as moving to grass cover or perennial cover, such as optimizing nutrient or management or dairy cattle management, could bring benefits in addition that would include soil conservation and water quality, which is something that all of you live and breathe every day. So I think in almost every one of the cases where we start thinking about these strategies, you see multiple reasons why these are good ideas that are triple win scenarios in a lot of cases. Next slide, please. The list of carbon sequestration, or more accurately, greenhouse gas reduction strategies in agriculture, I think includes things that every one of you as conservationists think about and do every day. Every one of these has benefits beyond greenhouse gas reduction. And again, these are the reasons why protecting soil, protecting water are triple wins when we think about what's possible in an agricultural environment. Next slide, please. On the forest side, we know that we have almost 16 million acres of forest in Wisconsin. And currently our DNR estimates that those forests store about 1.5 billion tons worth of CO2 currently. That would be roughly as much as the greenhouse gas emissions we emit as a state for about 15 years. So we know that forests are a tremendous store of carbon, but we also know that we can optimize that through better management, and that if we do that, we'll also achieve some benefits of creating forests that are more resilient. And that's the other, back to the other side of climate change in natural and working lands, is that the storm events and the flood events and the other stresses that are more and more predominant now operating on our natural systems are really threatening our ability of farmland and forest land to continue to provide benefits for people. So we'll talk more about that in a minute. Next slide, please. So at a real basic level, the things that we need to think about in order to continue to store the carbon and maintain the benefits we're maintaining with forests and to increase that it's real simple at its basics. One is keep forests in forest, keep conservation lands in conservation lands. When we lose those land bases because they're cleared or converted to other uses, those are tremendous releases of carbon that occur during those activities. That's in the world of carbon budgeting, that's known as a CO2 reversal. A mature hardwood forest might be storing somewhere around 400 tons per acre of CO2. Most of that will go up into the atmosphere in a situation where that land is simply cleared for conversion. We can plant trees on marginal lands or barren lands or unstocked lands, or plant trees in our managed forests to make sure that we're bringing back full stocking so that we really are storing carbon optimally on every acre. We can improve forest management by continuing to look at the practices that will help store more carbon. In many cases, that'll mean foresters managing for multiple species as opposed to single species, managing for multiple ages where possible, so that you may have trees ranging from 50 years to 150 years old, and managing for longer rotations, so that where it's possible to grow those trees to larger sizes before they're harvested, that creates more opportunity to store carbon for the long term and a longer window between disturbances that end up releasing carbon. And finally, we can use wood. And I'll just make the case that wood is a great material to build with for reasons that I'll talk about in just a minute. Next slide, please. So, you know, wood is a construction material that obviously has been understood for thousands of years. Today, there are new opportunities in construction with wood that are being realized because of advances in engineering and architecture, where the folks that put commercial buildings together have figured out how to use wood as a large-scale material and as a replacement for steel skeletons or aluminum or concrete. And what's known as mass timber in buildings is if you follow architecture, is kind of the new rage in commercial building design. Some of the benefits that brings are significantly lighter weight buildings, buildings that are much higher in energy efficiency because wood is such a good insulating material. Wood buildings are cheaper to cool and cheaper to heat. And you are storing carbon in that wood. So some of the material that came out of that forest that was hopefully and presumably well managed, that carbon, rather than being lost to the atmosphere, is being stored in a durable form that might have another 100-year life. But one of the most important benefits is that by supplanting steel or concrete or aluminum as a building material, the carbon footprint of that building is significantly less because of the much lower energy requirement needed to supply wood in a building material form. You're not firing a kiln to cook cement or running a furnace to mill and promote and make and manufacture steel. Next slide, please. But to keep moving on the natural and working land spectrum, the prairies and wetlands and conservation lands that you all as conservationists are charged with protecting and promoting, and everyone knows this, I think, but these systems are really powerful carbon sinks. You know, deep soil prairies, and actually any native prairie, is a significant carbon sink below ground because prairie plants are so good at grabbing sunlight and CO2 and sticking it below ground in the soil. So these are tremendous carbon sinks, intact native systems such as grasslands and wetlands. And in our wetlands, the amount of carbon below soil, as well as methane that is below soil, is stored in a fairly stable form until that wetland is disturbed or drained or dug up, in which case that carbon can be released. So again, protecting those carbon stocks in conservation lands, promoting development of conservation lands is a huge natural climate solution. Next slide, please. Finally, we'll talk about urban forests. And not to be ignored, the role of trees and vegetation and parks in urban forests has a significant climate offset benefit or carbon offset benefit. Per unit area, it's usually not as high as a forest or a prairie, for example, but still the opportunities for trees in cities as a climate mitigation benefit is significant. And in addition to that, the co-benefits that come with trees, the list is as long as your arm. You know, and again, this is mostly well known, but trees cool and shade. especially in cities that tend to become heat islands as climate change becomes more of a stress and a source of health impacts, especially for vulnerable populations. The shade from trees is a significant factor in ameliorating that. Trees improve the air quality by releasing oxygen, by filtering particulates. They reduce noise from highways, industrial activities. Trees improve public health, and these correlations are actually fairly well known and fairly well documented. Communities living with higher levels of tree cover, when you control other variables, have higher and better health outcomes. And unfortunately, the corollary is also true. The same is true with crime. Trees with very low, communities with low levels of trees tend to be less healthy. They tend to be more likely to experience chronic crime. And you can go down the list of things like educational outcomes, more economic prosperity. Trees tend to be associated with positive attributes of all those values. So the Lieutenant Governor talked about environmental equity and social justice. There is one of the strongest opportunities in our communities to help address environmental equity is to make sure that every community has trees. And by the way, we'll cool the atmosphere as well if we do that. Next slide, please. So in our urban communities or our urban forests, we can obviously increase tree canopy through planting the right trees in the right place. We can encourage tree cover at home and in businesses. We can look at tree equity. And in fact, there are some models right now to actually attempt to leverage private investment and corporate investment in buying carbon offsets from urban trees in urban communities. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. And finally, trees, of course, are only part of the overall need to look at green infrastructure in our cities and surrounding our communities so that we can help use that infrastructure to address flood abatement, snow barriers, noise reduction, and other environmental risks. Next slide, please. So again, back to our core strategies. Number one is protect what we have. And so protecting our intact carbon stocks, whether that's on farmland or in our forests or in our prairies and our wetlands, whatever we can do by policy and by practice and by education in keeping those lands intact and avoiding carbon reversals, as well as the other sort of downsides that come when we lose those resources. That's probably our number one defensive action for protecting both the benefits and the potential of our working lands to continue doing the job they do of offsetting greenhouse gas emissions. Then we begin to think about how to restore and increase the carbon reduction sequestration benefit of our carbon sinks and natural working land resources. And again, that's through tree planting, through restoring forests, through optimizing farm activity, looking at mechanisms that will reduce chemical inputs, reduce fertilizer inputs, reduce fuel, fossil fuel related operational inputs. And for any of our working lands, farms and forests, all of that activity translates to the bottom line, translates to reduced costs, reduced inputs. So to the extent that we can figure out how to do that, again, operators should be realizing multiple benefits. And finally, we'll talk for a minute about tapping into markets and some of the emerging markets that are rewarding activities that offset greenhouse gases. Next slide, please. I'm going to move through that one, given the sake of time. If you can go to the next slide, please. And I'm going to move through that one as well. If you can go to the next slide, please. So carbon markets or carbon offset markets are relatively new market opportunity. that essentially has the potential to reward working land managers for activities that will provide additional carbon offset benefits. So the basic idea of a carbon market, and unfortunately the schematic here is a little bit cut off with the fancy design I've got, but basic design of a carbon market is an entity that is either a regulated utility or a regulated industry, or an entity that has a non-regulated but a voluntary interest in investing in climate reduction or greenhouse gas reduction activity, can buy an offset, which is basically a measured increment of carbon to fund an activity that would generate that measured increment of carbon reduction. So to think about it in the mandatory or the compliance model, California right now is the one state in the country that has a statewide regulated cap and trade program that requires utilities and regulated industries to either meet greenhouse gas emission limits that continually drop down or ratchet down every year. And when they can't meet those limits, they're forced to buy offsets, either from other regulated entities that are able to meet those limits with excess, or they can purchase offsets from project developers that will achieve the same offset from a different activity. It could include solar panels or renewable energy development, but a very large component of compliance offsets in the US being driven by the California market currently are coming from forestry and to a growing extent from agricultural activities that generate greenhouse gas reduction. Those activities have to be fairly rigorously monitored and inventoried and verified so that their benefits can be clearly quantified with a fair amount of, I guess, rigor and assurance, and meeting fairly complex set of protocols. And once that happens, then that project developer has the ability to register those credits on an exchange where they can be purchased by a buyer who has a need to reduce their carbon footprint. The idea of voluntary markets is fairly similar, although in the case of a voluntary market, the buyer is not forced by law to make those investments. They just see it as good business. And up until March of this year, the really growing and really promising opportunity in voluntary carbon markets was the airline industry. So that there, in fact, is a global or international agreement among major global airlines to all reduce and offset their greenhouse gas emissions from flying, that would have driven a significantly larger demand for voluntary greenhouse offsets in the next several years. And one of the big unknowns right now is, of course, with the pandemic, it's a bit of an unknown what that's going to do to the trajectory of that market for the airlines as their operations have been so affected. But nevertheless, the voluntary markets for carbon are growing and have driven a lot of activity. And so I think in Wisconsin, we can look at these as emerging opportunities. Most of us yet have not personally had the ability to take advantage of carbon markets. The place where they are driving the most activity currently has been in large forest ownerships, usually large private forest land ownerships that are managed institutionally and that are large enough to be able to absorb the transaction costs that come with meeting all the requirements of some of these protocols. So currently, with our carbon markets, there's fairly high transaction costs because these are complex protocols that have to be followed. You've got to pay a lot of professionals to be involved in developing a project. Right now, that's a barrier to entry for small farmers and small forest owners. In addition, there are real ongoing concerns about whether these offset projects truly generate additional greenhouse gas benefits, with the idea being that true additionality means that investment led you to do something that you wouldn't have done already anyway. You know, if the industry is able to pollute more while they paid you to do what you were already going to do, there's no net gain there. And that's the kind of, honestly, the challenge that needs to be avoided through rigorous design in carbon offset protocols. Likewise, there needs to be some assurance that that activity will have some degree of permanence. In the California compliance market, it's 100 years. With some of the voluntary markets, it's more like 40 years that as a developer, you need to commit to maintaining that activity. And finally, there needs to be assurance that by doing a conservation practice on a farm in one township, you didn't simply transfer that activity to another ownership or another farm in another place. So the idea of leakage, meaning you just push the impact somewhere else, but didn't actually result in any net benefit. So a lot of demand and a lot of interest in tapping into carbon markets. I think we've still got a ways to go to have those potential markets be realized by a growing base of landowners. Next slide, please.
Fred, I just wanted to remind you of the time. I don't know if you could wind down in about 5 minutes so we still have time for a few questions afterwards.
I could, and we're very close to that, so thank you.
Okay, great, thank you.
Yeah. So this chart is simply showing the existence of current markets for carbon, and the upshot here is that voluntary markets opportunities are all over the world. The compliance markets that are really being driven by regulation in the US currently is limited to what's called the RGGI, or the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in New England and in California. But the California market especially is driving practices in Wisconsin and other parts of the country as a result of these offset projects. Next slide, please. If you look overall at the nature of carbon projects, the complex schematic here, the only thing you really need to understand about that is that about half of carbon offset projects currently are in the category of forestry and land use. And that includes agroforestry, tree planting, grassland, rangeland, both farm and forest related activities is the single biggest activity going on in these emerging markets. I'll be glad to send out links to these groups later for those folks that don't have time to write them down, but three players to be watching in this space. One is a group called Indigo Ag, which is already offering, at least publicly, the ability for farm producers to sell a carbon credit on a voluntary market. An organization in a similar space is the Ecosystem Services Market Consortium, which is a national group that's being led by a lot of agribusiness leaders who are together trying to develop both national and state level protocols to allow access to both carbon markets and water markets as ecosystem service markets that would be a benefit to farm producers. And finally, the American Forest Foundation is trying to do something similar for family forest owners through what they're calling a family forest carbon program. And Katie, I think I'll end there and open up a time for questions.
Okay, well, Whitney just put in the website addresses for these carbon markets that you have up on screen so that people can click them directly if they want. We do have a few questions for you. First, what area do you think has the most potential for carbon market in Wisconsin?
I think that right now, in terms of, I'll name two, in terms of what's presently potential, forests, as I mentioned, the large forest owners are already taking advantage of opportunity to sell carbon offsets. And that's can be a significant revenue generator for a large forest owner. The trick there is to create a mechanism to allow aggregation so that small owners can join together in a way to take advantage of the same opportunity while amortizing that transaction cost. I think we're probably a few years away from seeing a working model for that, but stay tuned for that. On the farm side, I think the Indigo Ag and the Ecosystem Services Market Consortium are both really focused on developing voluntary market offsets for both carbon and for clean water. And so what we're looking for are the protocols to be able to measure those in a way that they could be essentially established into offsets that could be traded on exchanges. And from what I've seen in that space, the food and beverage sectors are the industrial sectors that probably have the most likely willingness to want to buy into that. And the idea, especially of agribusiness companies that want to inset or to invest within their own supply chain to assure those benefits occur, is my understanding of the sort of play that will have the most potential for farm producers. So again, I think that's something that is probably a year or two away from gaining more traction, but really promising opportunities.
Okay. I guess an ag-related question. What cost share practices should counties be promoting to farmers to assist with carbon sequestration?
Well, I think that if you were looking for practices with the most impact or the most potential to offset greenhouse gas emissions, you would be looking at either conversion to pasture or reforestation or some combination of both. I think perennial cover is, as I understand it and what I've seen from the modeling, that is overall the most powerful practice that you can have for sequestering carbon and increasing greenhouse gas reduction from an acre of ground. Certainly other practices would have benefit and maybe a better fit for that particular operation. But from everything I've understood, that's where the big levers are.
Okay. Another question on counties. Do you know of any county forests participating in selling carbon credits in Wisconsin?
I am not aware of any county forests that are doing that at this point. And I'm not certain that they're not, but I've not been aware of it. Some of the public lands that may be the best opportunities, we've often talked about the Board of Commissioners of Public Lands, which most of you know owns about 80,000 acres spread throughout the north. The state of Michigan recently put out an RFP to developers to invite proposals to basically set up a carbon offset project on state of Michigan owned forest lands. And that's a land base in the realm of 3 to 5 million acres, I think, in Michigan. Tribal forest operations are also probably really good candidates for forest carbon projects, simply because the tribes have the autonomy, for the most part, to take those activities.
Okay. I don't see any more questions. If anybody thinks of anything, you can type it in this box and we can always follow up with Fred after the meeting as well. We'll stay on this channel for a while longer. Fred, thank you so much for your presentation. I'm sure you are hearing a very quiet virtual round of applause. Thank you for your time and your energy today. For those of you here, coming up next, we will have another presentation in this room, the retrospective of the producer-led watershed protection program. You can stay on the Zoom channel if you're interested in this particular session. In the chat box, you'll see a link to the virtual agenda, and that's where you can access the other sessions. In the main room, we have county conservation across Wisconsin. And in room C, we have a closed session for county conservationists, which will consist of updates with agency partners. Again, thank you for joining this county conservation meeting, and thank you, Fred, for presenting to us.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks, everyone.